more than half of the care occurs outside of an appointment, and that's very fundamental. Salvo is changing medicine from episodic to continuous, and that's profound. And so kind of the way Uber changed how taxis work or Netflix changed from appointment TV to on-demand, we're moving support into on-demand. I think the human touch on top of a lot of AI applications is still important to maintain. And I still see, the risk of it's better to view AI as augmenting the humans than completely replacing them. You see GIs doing 10, 20 scopes a day, and they just don't get out of their scrubs and they don't come into the clinic. And that has led to, I think, a profound human gap in care.
Jeff Glueck, founder and CEO of Salvo Health. I'm very thrilled to have you on the Scope Forward show. Very, very warm welcome.
Thanks, Praveen. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Jeff, you come from a background of Travelocity and Foursquare, and it's a big deal. How does somebody from technology navigate and land up in gastroenterology?
My dad was a resident at Mass General when I was born. So I grew up around hospitals, and then he moved us out to California where he was chief of staff of a hospital south of LA. So I grew up around doctors and physicians, but I also grew up with a mom who was very interested in what you now think of as lifestyle medicine, exercise and food as medicine and cutting ultra-processed foods out. But this was the 1970s. And so I saw this opportunity that I think Salvo represents to bring the best together of science-based, traditional medicine and clinic and hospital settings with the best of what you now think of as evidence-based lifestyle medicine. But that latter piece was looked down upon by many conventionally trained physicians like my father from Mass General. Meals were just beef and potatoes, exercise wasn't that important, and on and on. And so as someone who spent over 25 years building tech companies, Foursquare and Travelocity and Skyfire and others, I like to combine the best of both worlds. And I think tech allows us to do that. And so Salvo, as we'll talk about, is very much kind of a synthesis of the best of conventionally trained gastroenterology, and then thinking about functional disorders and follow-on care in a kind of new way that incorporates the best of this emerging field of lifestyle medicine. And so that goes back to me. So I've always wanted to do something bringing tech to help physicians, and Salvo is that. And we can talk about, there were other spurs to my desire to do something in healthcare.
I'd say gastroenterology is very lucky to have tech entrepreneurs like you interested in the field, because it's going to attract and bring in more talent, and it's important. I want to dig a little deeper with your story. As a founder, I know that there's often a trigger or an inspiration or an unmet need coming way back from maybe decades, like from your childhood even, or something that you saw that frustrated you, or what's the actual human story here?
I think you have to go back about 17, 18 years. My wife and I got married and were hoping to have a child, and we lost what would have been our first son at 23 weeks into a pregnancy. And it was really a tour through a lot of aspects that are sadly broken in American healthcare. The OB-GYN said, well, we don't test for that genetic issue until a woman's had 3 miscarriages because insurance companies don't want to pay for a test. And it didn't make any sense even economically. And we were devastated. And I remember sitting in Mount Sinai here in New York and with the OB-GYN and looking for some solace and asking the physician, please tell me, because I work in what we used to call big data. I had longitudinal data on hundreds of millions of people as CEO of Foursquare. And I remember asking, is there any way that our loss contributes so that the next couple sitting in these chairs is less likely to be, heartbroken? because please tell me there's some massive database with really deep records and the best physician researchers and the best data scientists are constantly improving, in this case, prenatal care. And the OB-GYN just shook her head and said, that would be phenomenal, but that's not how it works. This learning is just lost, basically. It was 18 years ago, but I remember thinking, I want to take all the things I've done, building technology that scales to millions of users, and data science that really is constantly learning off rich, large data sets that are diverse data sets. Healthcare is the most important field you can imagine. It's people's lives, not just life and death, but their vibrancy over decades, their ability to go on a date or a business dinner or spend time with their family or go to their kids' recital. Those are things that we encounter constantly with our patients. And it seemed broken that kind of learning engines weren't set up. And so when I sort of freed up during the pandemic and I had a chance to think about the company I wanted to start, I went back to that vow and was determined to build something that would use really rich daily learnings from patient-reported outcomes and physiological metrics and diagnostic tests and kind of create that precision managed and personalized engine for the future. And I'll come back to why GI and not, say, other subspecialties. And then the other thing that happened is when our twins were born, thankfully, when they came back from the hospital in Palo Alto, they kept breaking out these are newborns, and these terrible rashes, skin irritations. And it took us a while to sort it out, but we realized it was the things the hospital had recommended to us, the diaper cream and the breastfeeding pillows and other things that were full of these known skin intoxicants and endocrine disrupting chemicals and irritants. And so it started a journey for my wife and I, meeting a number of physicians who were into the field of environmental health. And so, I remember asking, well, why isn't awareness of all these hormone disrupting or microbiome disrupting kind of chemicals and pesticides, why is that problem not making its way into conventional healthcare? My wife started a nonprofit called madesafe.org and worked for a decade to make mothers and consumers aware of products that were sort of healthier for their children and their families. And as we met a lot of physicians in this area, I kept thinking there's got to be a way to incorporate that into sort of chronic disease management. And so that was another inspiration for us. I think when we started Salvo, we viewed gastroenterology, if you believe in these thinking, then gut health is the key to so many health journeys, right? And so it made sense to start with gut health, although I think this kind of whole patient follow-on care meets a gap in care in American medicine for other specialties as well over time. But we felt gut health was the right place to start, and particularly conditions that physicians aren't well remunerated to take care of or view as the best use of their time, conditions like IBS or MASLD, metabolic syndrome, and IBD as well, and where there just is a gap in follow-on care. So we can talk about it, but it was very much that personal journey where things felt broken. And I felt if I partner with leading GIs and academic researchers and healthcare experts, then I can add something to this mix by partnering and bringing my 25 years building tech companies.
Thank you for sharing that deeply personal story. It's very moving. And this is what it is. Unlike other industries, healthcare comes home. And what we do, what we don't do has an impact on the whole and eventually our families, our friends, and our own lives. I think entrepreneurs, people who've gotten involved in healthcare for a deeper and higher reason, I think it matters. It matters a big deal, and more is needed for healthcare, for gastroenterology. So I really appreciate you sharing that. Let's get back to Salvo. Can you touch a little bit more on what you discovered after starting? And if you can be just blunt and open about it, that would be great. So were you surprised by what you found in healthcare in gastroenterology, or one way or the other, like pleasantly surprised or shocked?
There are a couple trends in healthcare in GI and hepatology that didn't shock me, but really evidence of a deep gap in a way we could partner. One thing that's going on, of course, is among the independent GIs is the private equity trend. So it's turned out that for Salvo, a number of our best partners, customers have been private equity backed GI practices that are multi-state and very sophisticated enterprises. And part of what happens, which was already happening, is that there's a lot of pressure on the GIs to be in the endoscopy suite all day. And, there's this pressure to not even take follow-on appointments, essentially, and to pass those over to APPs or just not be involved in the follow-on care as if someone else, the primary care physician, has to pick it up. And so, you see GIs doing 10, 20 scopes a day, and they just don't get out of their scrubs and they don't come into the clinic. And that has led to, I think, a profound human gap in care, which is that, as you know, 99% of colonoscopies, endoscopies don't find colorectal cancer. It's the gold standard. It's absolutely what needs to happen for the best care. But what happens to those 99%? And frequently they have, whether it's a FibroScan or a colonoscopy, you have a chronic condition of a brain gut disorder, right? And DGBIs, and you have, or MASLD and fibrosis. And so this idea that GI can diagnose, let's say, MASLD stage 2, and then say, you really need to lose 10% of your body weight and come back in 6 months. That works in the society that we have today is just unrealistic. And we would talk to GIs and they'd say, and the patients come back and they're on the road to cirrhosis, and they haven't lost 10% of their body weight. I can't believe it. What did you expect? We have to provide patients a lot more support for that. And same with IBS, that is one of many chronic conditions, the GERD and celiac and IBD that we're focused on, but it's particularly a case where the microbiome, cognitive behavioral therapy, foodist medicine, GI psychology are really evidence-backed for this care, but it's very time-consuming. And so, again, you'd said this gap in care, the GIs don't have time for it. They're not really trained in nutrition or behavioral health or the like. And so it's a perfect marriage. So we saw when we were setting up Salvo Health that too often digital innovators come into a field like GI and in digital health, and their theory is bypassing the tremendous value that these community GIs have built. The trust of a network of primary care physicians, the trust of a community. So a lot of digital health, I think, has the wrong mental model, which is let's bypass the local clinicians. We'll create a digital center of excellence in the cloud. We see that, and we see that with some excellent companies that were launched first, frankly, several years before Salvo, but they work for the payers and employers, and they don't view profoundly the local community providers as people who need to be at the table driving the care into the future of medicine. And so, I'm a big fan of the kind of care that Oshi often provides, for instance. And I know we talked about how Salvo is different, but I think it's very different because our sort of reason for existence is to sort of help local community independent GI practices move into the 21st century and bring the best of technology wraparound care, but particularly that work with them. Only these GIs can do the colonoscopies and endoscopies and escalations and the like. And so rather than bypassing the local GI, Salvo is about empowering these local practices with a lot of tech and ancillary care as a profit center, but also keeping them under the sort of brand and care of the local GI, under the GI, but augmenting that physician with all this kind of outsourced staff in GI psychology and dietitians and the like. And so rather than the patients. Essentially, I always say this, the model that first came in GI innovation was, hey, we're going to partner with United Healthcare or Aetna or the like, and they're going to send a letter to everyone in Atlanta saying, hey, forget your local GI, come see our cloud, GI service. And it comes from the CEO of United Healthcare or the like. And, there are a portion of patients who will respond to that. And I think, Oshi or Cylinder can have a very successful business. But I would argue that in this world of AI, human trust really matters. And I think, in fact, to transform healthcare, we need to leverage the trust in those trusted relationships, which still exist in this world of AI. In fact, they're almost more valuable with your primary care physician who sends you to a trusted local GI. And when that GI says, I want you to do this program for your MASLD or your IBS with a dietitian and a GI psychology program, and I'll be your physician, but you'll have daily support for the next sort of 6 to 9 months for a personalized plan. That's a very trusted introduction to this kind of wraparound care, and I think really valuable. And it's also important that we can escalate back to the local GI. So Salvo was designed to be strategic partners for GIs, because when the care is driven by an insurance company, you can bet that there's a huge premium, not on what the physician thinks is the right medical care, but what will bend the cost curve. And I actually think the right way to bend the cost curve is better healthcare that keeps people out of ERs and addresses a variety of chronic ailments, and not by denying patients the right medication or the right kind of procedure. And so if you're a GI, particularly an independent GI in a sophisticated practice, I think what Salvo offers, which is we're going to be your partner, we're going to help you understand how AI can data mine your data and build much more longitudinal data on each patient. We're going to eventually prepare for value-based care arrangements where you can show higher quality of care and better outcomes and more ER avoidance and all that. So we're really deeply the partner augmenting the local physician instead of bypassing the physician. And I think that's a really big difference with some of the other sort of first generation of digital innovators in the space. Is we're building the best of your local community health and the best of telemedicine.
Few challenges come to mind, Jeff, and then I'll lay those out quite directly. So one is the challenge of money itself. Recently, I was in a conversation with a physician, and he was talking about the younger physicians in the group. It went like this. He said, nobody wants to see patients. They're all busy doing procedures. So I thought I heard him wrong. And I said, what do you mean nobody wants to see patients? So he said, no, because the obvious reason is managed care and how one is compensated. So there is that aspect. I brought up this anecdote. I can't remember with whom, but when I did, the person completely disagreed and he said, on the contrary, physicians do want to spend time with patients, but then the model doesn't allow you to, or the administrators won't allow you to, what have you. But the crux of this is the beast of the existing managed care model leadership program that I've run for a while called the GI Mastermind. When we bring up all the new ideas, the exponential technologies that one can implement, invariably somebody would bring up, but who is going to pay for this? I can actually quote this. It often goes, but who is going to pay for this? So one big aspect is money, managed care, the existing models. The second is a societal issue, whichever part of the world, is that patients themselves, there's the right way of approaching care, exact all the things that you've mentioned since the beginning of our conversation. For example, let's talk liver disease, right? So that it's going to progress, to the next stage to NASH and then cirrhosis, and it's going in that direction. But the reason that a patient is already set on that trajectory is largely because of lifestyle and because of certain things. Yes, there's genetics and other reasons, but that inflammation in the body has set in because the patient has not taken actions and does not want to take actions at the right time. I'm not beating up anybody, but I'm looking at this as a societal issue where the patient population itself does not want to take action, sign up, and all of that. I know your results may speak differently on both these counts, but I'm curious to see how you would respond.
Let's talk about how this can be profitable for physicians, and because it is reimbursable today. There's a myth that you can't get reimbursed for these things, and Salvo does. And secondly, we can talk about behavior change and lifestyle medicine and some of the places it will succeed and some of the limits that you raise, because it is asking patients to go on a journey with support, and not everyone is receptive, but more than you think, I would argue. So let's come back to that. In terms of reimbursement, I've heard some physicians say, oh, I care about my patients, but I'm running a business and I want to see them get access to registered dietitians covered by insurance. I want to see them get GI psychology, programs for their functional disorders, but I don't think it's reimbursed. So what Salvo does is come in and partner with a local provider group, and we provide all the staffing, all the tech, all the enrollment, all the home devices. And we're helping these physicians who generally aren't set up with ancillary services turnkey set that up at no cost to the local group. It's all kind of variable profit and sort of risk-free for the local physician group. And they're billing codes that are billed over $40 billion a year, like RPM and CCM, and grown tremendously, but still a tiny fraction of patients actually get these services relative to the potential. And the beauty of billing things like RPM is that almost all commercial insurance covers it, and Medicare Advantage is just universally covered. Whereas a lot of the, what I would call gimmicky programs that came before Salvo, would only do Medicare patients, and they would just have some nurses on a call center, and that was, just trying to get a little extra revenue. And that's not the right way to do it. And I don't think physicians wanted that kind of gimmicky service. And so instead, we're hiring dietitians and therapists out of places like Mass General and Clinic and folks like that, because they like our model better. Instead of they get a panel of patients, and their job is to work with those patients over a typical 7-8 months period to get them healthy and to figure out, to meet them where they are, and give them daily support. So there's an app, and all the minutes, not just the monthly session with your dietitian or your therapist, which is billable under RPM and CCM, but also more than half of the care occurs outside of an appointment. And that's very fundamental. Salvo is changing medicine from episodic to continuous, and that's profound. And so kind of the way Uber changed how taxis work, or Netflix changed from appointment TV to on-demand, we're moving support into on-demand. And so patients can chat with their team, and they won't get an instant answer, but they usually get an answer within 2 hours. And from their team, and they know their team, they've met them. And so when you have a chronic condition, you want a team behind you. The physicians don't have time for this, but our teams are set up with GI-focused therapists and dietitians trained in DGBIs and IBD and the like. And so we're able to do this whole patient care. And while the physician is in the endoscopy suite doing procedures, they know that they will also be able to bill the minutes that our nurses and dietitians and therapists are answering questions, checking in on patients, reviewing charts, uploading monthly summaries to the EHR, which we do because we believe deeply in coordinated care. So then the physician meets with that patient 4 months later. All that their team has done has been updated monthly in the EHR on the chart, so that physician is deeply in the loop, and physician can intervene and change the care plan if they want. It's really augmenting the local GI in a way that's very time efficient. So when we come in and we work with a physician group, one of the reasons that so many GI groups, now have under contract about 700 GIs in the United States. And so that's more than 10% of all the independent GIs in the country, and growing fast. And so, number one is this is profitable. Number two is it's going to save them time, because after a full day in the endoscopy suite, they don't want hundreds of messages to have to reply to. They want to be able to go home and, see their kid and the like. And so their EHR, my chart is full, and they don't, they're not properly compensated for that. And thirdly is that they want this kind of a care, and their patients want it. Their patients are asking, can I see a dietitian or the like. The problem in the US is that, too often it's not covered. If it's just an appointment, it's not covered by insurance, because a lot of dietitians are just billing outside of network, and, it can be $100 to $200 to just see a dietitian out of pocket. Whereas with Salvo, it's all covered by insurance. And there's a wonderful prominent company called Nourish, and there's a couple like that allows doctors to refer out to a dietitian, but they have a limited number of appointments they can get. And we've hired a bunch of people out of Nourish, so this is, I think, very relevant, the difference in continuous care and appointment-based billing. When you get hired as a dietitian by Nourish, they tell you, we're only going to pay you on a 1099 basis for appointments. So if a patient has a follow-on question, like, what's a legume in a low FODMAP elimination diet? Pretty good question, right? But the dietitians are told, don't answer it. Or if you do decide to answer it, it's on your own time. We're not compensating you for that. You're only paid for completed appointments. And by the way, no-shows, you don't get paid either. And so very differently, we employ these ancillary professionals. They're full-time employees. They're deeply trained. They're all licensed. And they value the minutes between appointments just as much. They're compensated equally for that. And that yields a totally different relationship for the patient. It's not about the appointment. It's about this ongoing change. And they're able to catch things, if they're doing a diary and they're able to see, that a patient has severe abdominal pain after consuming avocados regularly. They might communicate in the EHR with the supervising physician and say, between us, would you want to run a pancreatic enzyme deficiency test on this patient? Because it sounds like they're having a reaction to fat digestion. And the doc will say, yeah, that's good. I didn't think of that. And, and then you run the test, and there's a very easy, solution then for pancreatic enzyme deficiency, which completely changes the patient's life. But it takes a lot of time with the patient to look for those kinds of missed opportunities, and the GIs don't have time for that. So, it's that kind of deep partnership. That's the money works, but it's not just that it's profit center, which is, generally $20,000 to $40,000 profit per physician is what we see. And the codes are getting better in 2026 in numerous ways. There's 2 new RPM codes, which will make it even more profitable. Because we do RPM and CCM, we can help the physician across all ages, not just over 65. And most DGBI patients, most IBD patients, most MASLD patients are not Medicare patients, right? They're younger initially. And so it's really important to have your full patient panel be able to access this kind of wraparound services.
One clarification there, Jeff, which is, how do you make money? Who pays you?
So the physicians bill for these services, and generally they'll bill typically $150 a month, $140, $150 a month. And then they'll pay us as like a traveling nurse service, like a staffing service. So they'll pay us a little over, $100 or $110 on average per patient. So they're making, let's say, about $40 profit per patient, but we're providing the half of the practice and the enrollment. We're providing all the home medical devices, like a scale for a MASLD patient that's a digital scale. We're providing all the staffing, the quality control, and we put the CPT code in the RCM system that the physician will bill. So it's really turnkey, no EHR technical integration required. Our nurses and dietitians and therapists are just assigned a traveling nurse login basically to the EHR. So it's a profitable venture, but we work for the physician. Instead of hiring these people in-house, they're hiring our staffing service, like a locum service. Let's be clear, this is America, and there can be a culture of a pill for an ill, right? And the like. And so I don't know exactly, Praveen, what percent of people are willing to make some lifestyle changes, but I would argue that society and education in this country don't make it very easy. So I think at least a third of Americans don't want to be on medications their whole life, and they don't want to be on 8 medications. And they are willing, but they sometimes they have shame. And so it's a really big part of the Salvo program designed by some eminent GI psychologists, including Dr. Megan Oser, who designed Mahana, if you're familiar with Mahana, and is one of our advisors, and designed the GI Psych program at the Brigham and Harvard Medical School. It's very important to break these into very easy, small steps that anyone can start. It might be taking a walk. It might be learning to just close the kitchen after dinner till breakfast. Just adding some berries to breakfast, adding some fermented foods to lunch. Very small steps. So we have about 400 small steps for different for IBS-C or IBS-D or, Crohn's or whatever. But there's several hundred very small changes that you can start with, and you're just doing, you might work on one for 2 weeks. That's it. Just like something very easy. And our therapists are very good and our dietitians at sort of asking, does this sound like something you can fit into your real life? Not you're a real estate agent, you've got 2 kids, you're on your feet all day, you never get to stop and eat. What can you do? And so we're very good at sort of fitting small changes into people's lives that actually start adding up and make big changes. So we just submitted our 4th accepted research paper, but we just at DDW had a great accepted research abstract on IBS results, and basically about 60% of patients had notable symptom and quality of life improvements on our IBS program within 60 days. And that's, by the way, that's better than the FDA approval studies for Xifaxan or, a couple other Linzess and some other meds. So just on the treatment effect, this multi-dimensional interdisciplinary care just works, period. And it works fairly quickly. I'd say, and it takes time to build the panel. So if you're a GI practice launching this, it's going to take 6 to 12 months to get the population that you're billing for. Each month you'll sign up sort of 5 or 6% of all the eligible patients, but they love it. They, over 90% continue each month. And so you build this panel essentially over time, and it's a profit center. So you don't need every patient to enroll. And the number one reason people disenroll is they feel better and they've learned the skills. We encountered Naresh Gunaratnam, who's an advisor to Salvo on our clinical advisory board, along with folks like Mark Pimentel and Emra Mayer and Megan Oser and others. Naresh always tells the story of working with MASLD patients in Minnesota, and one woman who said to him, he asked, well, why are you drinking, 2 liters of diet soda a day? And she said, well, my doctor told me to stay hydrated, so I figured, the state of medical education or nutrition education in this country is abysmal, and the FDA does not protect you at all. And so, there's all kinds of ultra-processed food additives that are endocrine disrupting chemicals and pesticides that affect the microbiome, right, or your endocrine system. And so, and affect obesity and other chronic diseases. So we just start with some basics. People don't know not to cook on a scratched Teflon pan or microwave plastic. Both those are endocrine affecting impacts. It's very easy to change. People don't know about it, and it does contribute to obesity, as you know. So there's just so many ways that just basic education can help folks. We don't need to turn people into Arnold Schwarzenegger. We can talk about GLP-1s and how Salvo augments those on GLP-1s, and I think that's about 1/3 of our patients now. But we find really that there's a good part of America that does want to change their lifestyle in ways that work for them, and I think they're open to it, and they don't want to be on 8 medications for the rest of their life. Maybe it's not the majority, but we're talking about, 80 million Americans on MASLD. We're talking about, 40 million IBS patients. We're talking about 60 million GERD patients. We're talking about 45% of America that is obese or pre-obese, right? And so 1/3 of those patients being willing to enroll is a really massive.
That's a large number. It does add up to very, very large number. And if you're making that kind of change, very, very impressive. You can share your thought that you had on GLP-1s. I'm curious how you build that into the whole program, and also curious, the patients who are on GLP-1, what percentage roughly are interested in continuing lifelong on GLP-1s, and what percentage are interested in weaning out of it and then actually making lifestyle changes, assuming that this is like a band-aid solution?
It's a great question. I think we're early in the application of GLP-1s, especially into the mass market, right? Early on, you had a lot of cash pay folks who weren't even the right medical candidates, but they wanted it for various reasons. But for GLP-1s, the early data outside of trials where you provide the medication for free, like the early data is that, the majority of patients don't stay on them for over a year. Obviously, you see tremendous sort of initial weight loss, tirzepatide in particular, over 20%. But because a lot of people have strong side effects, right? GI side effects in particular, for many people, they're paying out of pocket, and even the lower prices now with Novo Direct or Lilly Direct, you're talking about $500 a month, cash pay. That's fine for, affluent folks, but for the average American, they don't have an extra $500 a month, right? They're on it for a period, but they want to wean off of it because of the side effects or the cost or that may evolve as prices come down and it's covered more. So it's a little early in the game, but most of the data shows that if when you do leave semaglutide, the average return is over 75%. In other words, people regain 75% of lost weight, or in many cases, 100%. And the other thing that we really see in how we help the patients is if you ever want the option to titrate down or titrate off, you need to be combining the medications with dense protein-rich meals, right? Even when you don't feel like eating, to avoid sarcopenia, we're putting people onto resistance training programs to avoid, loss of lean muscle mass. And, you want the loss in the adipose tissue, not in the lean muscle mass. And so most Americans aren't getting those wraparound, even though it says on the label, of tirzepatide to be combined with nutrition changes and exercise changes. Everyone forgets about that, even though it's on the label, right? And so I think we're not doing Americans a service to have them, in many cases, or the employer pay thousands of dollars if they're going to regain it all and actually have a worse metabolism because of the lean muscle mass loss. So I think it's pretty essential to combine these things. And there's a lot of evidence that exercise doesn't lead to weight loss, but it is critical in keeping the weight off after, a sort of lower calorie period. And so these are the kinds of things that Salvo does really well when the physicians don't have time for it, using dietitians and therapists, cognitive behavioral therapy, resistance training, dietary changes, and the like, even just working on more fiber in the diet, right? And kind of cutting some of the ultra-processed foods and adding in fermented foods and fiber and things like that. Those are a key part of most gut health programs and metabolic syndrome changes.
Now, Jeff, you shared some numbers earlier. You said 700 providers you're serving, and then you also shared pricing and all of that. Any other numbers that you can share? Like, so your funding, what kind of funding and how many dietitians or people that you employ to do this? Are they full-time, part-time? Anything that will help listeners get the big picture in the context of your company?
So Salvo has raised over 10 million, put that into sort of orchestration technology that allows each patient to have this kind of interdisciplinary team, and go through a very personalized journey of, 6 to 8 months long on average. And so we put a lot of tech into creating this fabulous app and personalized care plans and the like. We just raised an additional $4 million that we're announcing this month to really scale up the number of dietitians and therapists and nurses that we employ. We only use employees. We train them deeply. They're all licensed professionals. They're all really good at what they do. It's been great to hire folks like that because we can hire from the entire country. We just need to make sure that the patients, have professionals that are clinically licensed in their state. And, instead of being in a hospital where you might see a patient for a couple of days and then you don't know what happens to them, it's a very satisfying outcomes-oriented relationship because, they work with one dietitian, one therapist, one nurse for, say, 8 months. They get to know each other and they're tracking the data over time. And so the assignment is, keep people, meet them where they are. Don't let them drop off out of guilt of not being perfect. And then they see this tremendous gratitude. Let's be honest, because of the way it's only partly managed care, it's also the way the AMA CPT committee works, right? The procedures are heavily remunerated for 20-minute blocks, and chatting with a patient about nutrition change is not heavily remunerated for the same amount of time, right? And so that's partly the AMA CPT code bias as well in American medicine. So the reality is this can be profitable, but also really change. One of the stats and studies that we did that we're really proud of is created a sort of 2-arm study, people who almost enrolled in Salvo, but chose not to enroll, with IBS and other sort of DGBI functional disorders, and then people who did enroll in Salvo. And we watched them just over, several months. And we saw a 79% reduction in ER and urgent care utilization for GI-related reasons in the Salvo treatment arm versus control arm. And it just stands to reason, if you have a chronic condition and you're treating it proactively, then you're not in the ER at 2 a.m. on a Friday night with abdominal pain unnecessarily, which is a terrible place to treat a chronic condition and really expensive, right? And so this, we know, and we've worked with actuaries like Milliman and the like. So even though our clients are the providers, from the Milliman data, we should be saving the payers and employers $3 for every dollar that they're reimbursing for this kind of interdisciplinary care. Mm-hmm. So, we're really proud of our numbers. 4 accepted research abstracts, 2 you can look up, and I think we're just getting started.
I want to bring our conversation to a conclusion by talking about the future of gastroenterology, future of digital health itself, maybe an angle to digital GI, especially in the context of where artificial intelligence and other exponential technologies are doubling every few months. So with that context in mind, where do you see everything going?
It's such a great question, and I think AI is going to profoundly change so many things in medicine, and people need to be developing their AI strategies very quick, right? And I think I've seen some lists of 300 or 400 use cases for AI in medical context, both back office and in the care context as well. I think Salvo, look, we're a tech company. We're ultimately kind of what I would have called machine learning at Foursquare, and now we'd call AI, but sort of large data sets and constantly mining them for insights. Remember, our patients take physiological tests or symptom surveys that are validated surveys 3 times a week on average for 8 months straight. And so we have tons of longitudinal data. We have all this data that can be mined in the chats and the video chats between clinical staff and patients. And so we really have a deep understanding of the patients, what they're actually adhering to, and then the results. And so we're building, as I mentioned, this kind of 400 different small step interventions, psychological profiles for patients at intake, as well as medical histories. And then we're able to track what works. So unlike most sort of physicians who might see a patient for 10 minutes twice a year, we have really deep kind of longitudinal data to mine about this patient is doing, this low FODMAP reintroduction at this point, and their symptoms are improving here and that, or they're doing diaphragmatic breathing daily, and that's really making a quality of life difference or the like. And so there's sort of rich data to build, RAGs on top of an LLM. In other words, like there's a general large language model, but then there's very specific protocol trained layers you can build on top of the AI to improve care. I'm a little old-fashioned in one way, which is I still think over millions of years of evolution that created human beings, we're social animals. And so, although I do see, there are examples of patients who, when they have nothing else, they're very excited to talk to an AI therapist or the like. But for the most part, our patients are really grateful to have actual expert humans to talk to. IBS in particular used to be called hysterical housewife syndrome, and there was a lot of gaslighting. And so now we understand that 90% of your serotonin is made in your gut. And so you have this sort of neurotransmitter issue frequently, which is why 3/4 of our functional patients also have anxiety and depression and clinical measures. I think the human touch on top of a lot of AI applications is still important to maintain. And I still see, the risk of it's better to view AI as augmenting the humans than completely replacing them. There will, be exceptions to that. But I just think you still see hallucinations and other things that are. So I think this idea that humans will do what humans do best and which is a lot of empathy and behavior change and emotional support and expert tips and the like that is personalized to each patient. But a lot of the both back office and sort of grunt work will go to AI, and we'll see each human able to be much more productive. We're not planning, Hinge Health just IPO'd. And so they've almost completely replaced physical therapists in their, home PT. I think that works in a lot of cases pretty well for follow-on care, but there's something about a really good PT going into the office and getting the physical muscle and tendon manipulation, the diagnostic skill of a really good PT, some of the machines they can do in an office. I don't think that all PT will be replaced, right? And I think in GI, it's very personalized. And so there's lots of ways AI will happen, but I still think humans are going to want a human interaction, especially in this AI world, that they can build trust relationships. But already at Salvo, 2/3 of the care minutes are done by software alone, just to be really clear. And 1/3, which is the part we bill, is nutritionists and dietitians and therapists. So 2/3 of the care happens in the app with kind of Calm and Headspace-like modules around daily diaphragmatic breathing or education or the like, or chat asynchronous or the like. And so already 2/3 of the care is software, and I think that's just going to grow over time.
Excellent. What's the holy grail for Salvo Health?
Well, I think we're very much building with leading gastroenterologists a kind of engine that eventually improves medical care in a very personalized way. So if you go back to my experience of sitting in that hospital after losing what would have been our first son and lamenting that there was no learning from every single patient interaction, our goal is that based on your psychological readiness for change and your mental models and your genetics eventually and your medical history, that we can come up with the right sequence of interventions with the highest propensity to lead to both adherence and outcomes. And so that is the kind of future of personalized medicine that we will partner with the physicians to center. That's ultimately right now what we're doing is bringing the best of wraparound care to physicians, but ultimately what we're building is better healthcare, the best of in-person physicians and the best of kind of this remote care, right? And so that is, I think, the future. And I think AI will help us mine that data deeply and build that, but it's moving away from one size fits all. And it's true on, although our scope of practice is not the decisions about procedures or pharmaceutical prescriptions, because that belongs to the physicians who we partner with. But, you think about the FDA model in the United States, right? It costs hundreds of millions to bring a new drug especially a biologic, to commercial use. And, I've talked to leading researchers about this. A lot of the drugs that make it through the FDA process, when you look at the RCT lift versus placebo, they might help 20, 30%, often sometimes just 10% of patients over placebo on the medication, which means 70% of patients are not better off with that medication than placebo, and they may have side effects as well. If you're a large pharmaceutical company, with some exceptions, once you get your license to print money with your patent, you're not that interested in figuring out which 70% of patients won't benefit from your drug. You might, want some data to sort of show that this drug is better for this kind of patient versus 7 other similar drugs for IBD or the like. But I think that one of the things that's broken is we don't really follow outcomes richly in a kind of multidimensional way. And I think of gut health as needing at least 3 legs of the stool, right? And so if you just have a talk therapy or CBT or a motivational interviewing program, and you don't combine it with diet changes, right? Food as medicine, fermented foods and fibers and reduction in ultra-processed foods and pesticide-laden foods, you don't combine both, you're not going to see the impact, but you combine them both with the best of proper diagnostic care, making sure people are tested, the calprotectin, tested for celiac, tested for all the things, that pancreatic enzyme deficiencies, all the things that need to be done to get to the right diagnostic outcome. Those 3 legs of the stool have to work together, and that's not the way pharmaceutical research works, right? It's always one variable, not interdependence. So we were building sort of ultimately this kind of multidimensional interdisciplinary roadmap of how to improve care. And I think that starts deeply with gastroenterology, the 5,000 independent GIs, the 10,000 system GIs in America, but it also applies, you can imagine, over time to other subspecialties, dermatology, endocrinology, cardiology, fertility, and women's health. I mean, there's so many subspecialties where you have the kind of similar procedural gaps in care. And this kind of whole patient approach, I think, if it can be done profitably, can be applied. So we're really the allies ultimately of more personalized medicine and of specialty physicians across the country.
Fantastic, Jeff. This was such an enjoyable conversation. We went in many different directions, and I wish you and your team the very best. I'd love to see the Salvo Health model be wildly successful and deeply impact gastroenterology and healthcare as a whole. Thank you so much for sharing everything that you did. This was an amazing conversation.
Thank you, Praveen, for all you're doing to sketch out what the future of gastroenterology can look like as well, and for this invitation.